First of all, we're going to talk about what is spiritually integrated counseling or psychotherapy. We're going to talk about what spirituality is and what it's not. I have this kind of radical idea that before we can help people with spiritual issues in therapy, we have to understand what spirituality is. We have to understand what it is. We have to be able to evaluate it. In particular, we have to understand how it can be a part of the solution to the problems people bring to us. But also, in reality, we have to recognize that sometimes it can be a part of the problem. Religion and spirituality at times can make matters worse. So we need to take a look at both sides of that coin. And with that understanding we'll be talking about this morning, then I think it sets the stage for the part that I'm sure you're most interested in, which is, and what you're involved in, which is how do we do the work of integrating spirituality into our counseling. So that's kind of like the plan for the day. If you find this really fascinating, and the material I'm talking about, a lot of it comes from a book I wrote on spiritually integrated psychotherapy. We may have some copies of it here. And also, more recently, we published a very heavy, literally, 2-volume handbook of American Psychology Association Handbook of Psychology, Religion, and Spirituality. It is about 60 chapters, but it's a more update review of what we know in the field on both the research side and the practical side. The field's growing so rapidly, and it's been exciting to see. The most common question I get is, who are you? And it's, I think, an understandable question. You want to know, particularly in this area, is your speaker, what's his or her agenda? Are they coming in from a secular perspective, trying to invalidate spiritually integrated therapy? Are they coming in with a more of evangelical agenda, trying to persuade you about the rightness or wrongness of a particular religious position? Who are you? I think it's an important question. And so let me spend a few minutes talking about my background, and then we can move on. I went into psychology, clinical psychology, because I was interested in the big questions. I suspect many of you went into your vocations or counseling because of the same reasons. You were interested in how do we help people? How do we make the world a better place? What makes people tick? The big questions. And I went to graduate school in 1972. That's when I started. I was 4 years old at the time, so I'm still relatively young. And I was disappointed. I only semi-jokingly say that my very first client was weighed 5 pounds, and I called him Walter. He was a pigeon. And actually, I learned a lot from Walter. It was a class on operant conditioning, behaviorism, which is very popular at that point in time. And I learned about principles of reinforcement, reward and punishment, which can be very helpful working with some groups. Autistic kids, people with some serious mental illness can be really helped through operant principles. But as valuable as Walter was, he wasn't real helpful when I raised the big questions. Walter, why are we here? He was mum. He didn't say a word about the big questions. And so I looked elsewhere, and I found myself in graduate school drifting to reading about religion, drifting to attending various churches, synagogues, mosques, and talking to people about the role of faith in their lives. Why? Because even though I may not have agreed with some of their answers, they were grappling with the same questions I was. Why are we here? How do we make the world a better place? How can we bring some peace and healing to people's lives? We were talking, in an odd way, the same language. I was interested in for personal reasons too. I grew up in a conservative Jewish family in Washington, D.C. That had always been an important part of my identity, but I wasn't quite sure why. I didn't have a deeply religious education. I learned how to read Hebrew, but not understand Hebrew. Just like some people in the Catholic Church could read Latin, but not necessarily understand Latin. So I wanted to learn more about my own tradition, but I didn't want to restrict myself to my own tradition because I believed there was something to be learned about religion more generally. And so I went to a variety of different churches, synagogues, mosques, as I said. And I was so enriched by my conversations with people. I found that there was tremendous emotional power in the stories that people shared with me about how their faith was involved in the most challenging times of their lives. Birth, illness, accident, death, divorce. Religion was never boring. People spoke with tremendous power. And again, they spoke about religion in terms of the double-edged nature of it. For some, it was the most important resource that was life-saving. And for other people, they described some real frustration and bitterness about the place of religion in their lives. But in any case, it was always emotionally powerful. And so I became intrigued and started studying more and more, as I have for the last 40 years. I should say that it's enriched my own sense of Judaism. It's been enriched by my learning from religions in the world, including Catholicism. And I feel very fortunate to have been touched that way by people of different faiths and traditions. And I continue to learn and grow that way. Well, let me move on then and talk a little bit about the challenges in this kind of work. Just note up front, this is challenging work that we're doing. It's challenging in part because it is an emotional topic. No one is neutral. When I present to psychology groups, and psychology groups tend to be the most secular of all groups, it's not a neutral presentation. You can cut the tension in the room with a knife. We're talking about people who may be committed atheists, but people who are emotionally committed atheists. And so they express a lot of feeling and a lot of anger at the God they don't believe in. This is emotional power. So whether you're devout and committed, or whether you've left an organized religion, or whether you're atheist, this topic is emotionally sensitive to many, many people. Very few people I find are just totally emotionally detached from this topic. If you want to create some real energy and emotion at a dinner party, for instance, you can either talk about Donald Trump, or you can mention the word religion. And watch what happens. I mean, you will not be bored. On the other hand, you may find you're not invited to many dinner parties. It's challenging as well because there's a gap between mental health professionals as a group and the people that we serve. I have to tell you that you are exceptions to the rule, but you are abnormal. The people in this room are abnormal. And I mean that in the purely statistical sense. In the United States, about 96% of the population believes in God. If I pick on my own subgroup, clinical psychologists, do you know what percentage of clinical psychologists believe in God? 3%? It's about 25%. About 25%. So on average, when clients come to see therapists, we're talking about clients who have some level of religious faith and belief who are seeing therapists who don't. That creates a religiosity gap and some tension in the worlds that the clients are coming from and therapists are coming from. And some tension when we try to present what we do, which is integration work, to the general mental health community. I mean, I'm sure you have your stories you could tell about it. I remember talking to one of my colleagues, a very well-respected psychodynamic therapist, and I was talking to him about work we were doing on the prayers of college students as they're walking back and forth to campus, and find that students on back and forth from campus are praying, and it's not uncommon. And the psychodynamic therapist said to me, he said, So are you saying we have a problem with a lot of psychosis on campus? Prayer equals psychosis? What's wrong with that kind of understanding? It's misguided. So that makes it challenging to present the work that we're doing and in the light that it truly deserves. The other challenge in this area is that most people, again, you, I believe, are abnormal this way, but most people in the mental health field receive little, if any, training on religion and spirituality. Matter of fact, most graduate students go through social work, psychiatry, psychology, counseling programs without a single course on religion and spirituality. None. And so we're left with people who, even if they were interested in addressing the spiritual dimension of their clients' lives, they don't know how to do it. And I can't tell you the number of therapists I've worked with who said, I'd like to do this, but I don't know what to do. And so I'm really uncomfortable. I don't want to work outside my competence, which is good. So when my clients bring up religion or spirituality, I try to change the subject. Well, that's a shame, because sometimes, as we'll see, as you know, the spiritual dimension may hold the key to transformation. Changing the subject just won't do. Anyway, all of these are reasons why this area is challenging. But having said that, as you know, we can't afford to ignore it. Let me share a clinical story with you. It's from my early days as a therapist, but it's stayed with me over the years. And it really did shape my own work. And I still have contact with this client, by the way. Her name, I'll call her Alice. And I saw Alice in the 1980s. At that time, she was about 40 or so. And she was coming in because she'd been dealing with bipolar illness for much of her life. She was dressed very plainly, a t-shirt and pants, and her hair was just straight. But I liked her right away because she had this little sparkle in her eyes. And I asked her to tell me her story, and she did. And she had been dealing with bipolar illness for many years and had never had stability in her life. She had been suffering from tremendous mood swings for her life and had been hospitalized on the average 2-3 times a year. And her depressed periods were very dark, dealing with suicidality, dealing with just tremendous bleakness and despair. She hadn't been able to keep a job. She had been alienated from her family. She had some friends, but they were difficult for her to sustain relationships. She had seen many, many therapists, psychiatrists, psychologists, social workers, so I was just one more of the legion of therapists she'd worked with over the years in Toledo. And I worked with her for a year, and I was no more successful than anyone else. Hospitalized her twice, witnessed her mood variation, medications weren't helpful. Nothing seemed to be helpful with Alice doing my usual kind of therapies. One day she's in my office and she's quite upset, again talking about suicide, has an active plan, and I'm thinking, oh my gosh, I feel so terrible for this woman and I'm not helping her, but I need to get her to the hospital. So we're talking about that and she's crying hysterically, and in the middle of her tears she says, oh, when will my suffering end? When will my suffering end? And I heard her, and I remember feeling it was biblical, the language. It sounded like a lamentation. And Alice had never really talked about her faith, and I, at that time, hadn't pursued it. But I responded using similar language. I said, Alice, where do you turn to for solace in the midst of your suffering? Which is a little bit unusual for me. I'm not a solace kind of guy. I don't usually say solace. You could talk to me for 5 hours and solace will never come up. I might say, hey, how you doing? I won't say, so where do you turn to for solace in your life? That was a little unusual, but Alice heard my response, and she stopped, and she looked at me, and she said, well, I've never told anyone this, but when I was first hospitalized, when I was about 13, they put me in restraints, and I was in the rubber room, the room to keep her from hurting herself in the hospital. And I knew I was going to die, and I was so frightened. I remember crying and crying. And then I felt this warmth in the center of my chest. and it started to spread through my body. And it spoke to me. I said, wow, what did the voice say, Alice? She said, it said, I'm with you, I'll always be with you. Alice, who was talking to you? She said, oh, that was God. God was telling me that no matter how bad things got, God would always be with me. I said, oh my gosh. I said, have you ever had that experience since? She says, yeah, I have it sometimes when I'm in my darkest places. And she says, and sometimes I have it when I'm with someone who really cares about me. She says, like now. She said, don't you feel it? Well, my training as a psychologist would have taught me to say, so you're wondering whether I can share this experience with you. And thank God I bit my tongue and didn't do that. Instead, I did a little soul searching, and I realized I do feel something sacred in that moment. And we just stopped and shared it for a while. And I realized as we started to talk about her experience that she had stopped crying. She wasn't hysterical. And towards the end of the session, I said, you know, you look much more composed to me. Are you still feeling suicidal? And she says, no, I don't feel suicidal. I said, well, I always had her sign anti-suicide contracts to make sure she'd be safe. Can you sign the contract? She says, yeah, I think I can. As she was leaving, I stopped her and I said, Alice, you know, you said something to me that really struck me. You said you've never mentioned this experience to anyone before. And believe me, she was a mental health veteran. Many years of therapy with many therapists, and she'd never mentioned this experience. I said, how come? She said, well, they already think I'm crazy. And that just struck me. I mean, I hear it now as if it was yesterday. What an indictment against the mental health system that here, the most important life-affirming resource that I think saved her life, this sense of spiritual connection, she'd never mentioned it to any of her therapists, never mentioned it. Well, I'll come back to this story because this totally changed the nature of my counseling with Alice. We focused from that point on the question of how do we cultivate her spirituality so that she could draw on that wonderful gift she had, but not just at times of deepest darkness, more regularly in her life. And that's what we focused on, and it did change. Okay, well, with that story in mind, let's move on. And I want to talk a little bit first we're going to talk about how do we understand spirituality now. And first I want to talk about some stereotypes about spirituality that, I know I'm preaching to the choir here, or you understand this, but I still want to stress it, and this may be useful as you explain this to some of your colleagues or people who are more skeptical about the kind of work that we do here. So what spirituality is not. And one thing is spirituality is not simply a defense against anxiety. That's very popular in the literature in mental health, that spirituality is purely a defense mechanism, a way of helping people avoid anxiety. Well, religion and spirituality serve many purposes. For some, it can help reduce anxiety, but that's not the only purpose. And I just want to highlight that with a few examples. For many people, their faith is central to their search for meaning in life. Answering the question, why are we here? What's the purpose of life? We're meaning-seeking creatures. And faith offers that sense of meaning for many people. It's very easy to find this in the popular literature where you can find these books that are bestsellers. Where is God When It Hurts by Philip Yancey, When Bad Things Happen to Good People by Harold Kushner, Why Me, Why Anyone, The Purpose-Driven Life, The Road Less Traveled by M. Scott Peck. These are all books that are all focused on that question of why are we here? People are seeking answers, and they look to their faith for purpose, for meaning. It's not anxiety reduction, it's making sense of the life. What's my ultimate goal? What's my destination in life? Another purpose in life, another function of spirituality is intimacy, relationship, connectedness. People yearn for connection. We did some really I think, fascinating interviews years ago about what people look to or look for from their faith. And as one of the priests, a colleague of mine, was willing to be interviewed for this, and he had recently suffered the loss of his mother, his mother who he beloved. And we were talking about he allowed me to tape our interview, and he described the character of the funeral for his mother. And listen to his language when he describes it, and this theme of the power of community and connection. He writes, or he says, "The funeral was astounding. The whole church was there. Many, many friends were there. My blind niece played the piano, and my best friend gave the homily. There were so many powerful religious expressions and family expressions. It's hard to separate one from the other. Religion, family, religion, community, religion, church. How do you separate them? They're all interconnected, and that's an important purpose. For some people, that's the main reason they're involved in their faith, is for that sense of connectivity. For others, their faith allows them to make transformations, allows them to help negotiate important times of transition in their lives. This was another interview we did with a Mormon man who described his experience in the death of his wife in a car crash. And he says, "I knew she was killed. There was a big gash on her wrist and it wasn't bleeding and I couldn't get any pulse. I felt I could lay my hands on her and bring her back." That's a Mormon tradition. And then he hears a voice, and the voice says to him, "Do you want her back a vegetable? She's fine, she's all right," and to let her go. So what is God telling him in this case? It's not to hold on. It's to let go. The faith is involved in helping people make a transition, an important transition in life, from life to death. It becomes a transition. And in the religions of the world, including Catholicism, there are traditions that are really designed, I believe, to help facilitate major life transformation. We tend to be conservative creatures, meaning we tend to hold on and not want to change. We tend to resist change. That's just the way we're wired. But at times, change is necessary. And through religion and ritual in particular, we're able to be eased through that transitional process and move from one status in life to another. Now, as important as these functions are of spirituality and religion, the most important function is the search for the sacred. And we can find evidence of people seeking out something transcendent, something godly from the earliest ages. This is from Robert Cole's book, The Spiritual Lives of Children. And this is a 9-year-old boy who says, "I'd like to find God." But he wouldn't just be there waiting for some spaceship to land. He's not a person, you know. He's a spirit. He's like the fog and the mist. I should remember that God is God and we're us. I guess I'm trying to get from us to him with my ideas when I'm looking up at the sky. We can find examples of even younger kids looking for God. From the age of 2 or 3, the very first signs of being verbal, kids will talk about God. You get that sense of curiosity and the exploratory drive to seek out something larger than themselves. Okay, one other point I want to make of what spirituality is not. It's not a passive way of life, which is another stereotype. Mental health professionals tend to see religion as avoidant, a way of avoiding the head-on confrontation with reality. And the research here is pretty clear that that's a fallacy. We did a study on different styles of coping and the involvement of God in coping. And the style that's most criticized by mental health professionals is deferring, which is basically the belief that if you have a problem, you don't think about it, you let God do it for you. So you become passive. That's the stereotype about religious people. And what's often preferred in the mental health field is to be self-directing, internal locus of control, solve problems yourself, face up to it, deal with it, move on. That's the kind of like the American ethic of how we're supposed to be. Well, there's a third style that we've identified, and it's collaborative, which means that when you run into problems, it's not all on God and it's not all on you, it's on the relationship. That what matters is whether you have a partnership with God, a collaborative relationship, that you have God works together with you. Now, of these three styles, which do you think is most common? Any guesses? The most common is collaborative. Most people, when they talk about working with God or giving it up to God, they're really talking about a partnership. They're not talking about, I'm not doing anything, I'm just letting God do it, and I'm going to sit here like a vegetable. For most people, it's about a relationship with God that they count on. They try to work together with their understanding of God or Jesus to move forward in their lives. And that makes a large difference. One more example of what spirituality is not is it's not easy to describe. It's not easy to describe. I came across this cartoon that kind of captures that for me. I'll read it for you, but I love this cartoon. Okay, so you got a bunch of dinosaurs here, okay? So one dinosaur is saying, hey, everybody, look out. And it's pointing up to the sky, and there seems to be something flaming from the sky coming down to Earth. And this dinosaur is saying, hey, everybody, look out. It's one of those, that fire and stuff. And on the bottom of the slide, the cartoon, it says, despite its name, the thesaurus was quite often at a loss for words. Well, this says something about my sense of humor, but I read that, and I think that's like spirituality. You know, it's like that great big thing in the sky, but what is it? You can't find the words for it. It's so hard to put into words. And in fact, some of the greatest scholars in this area have commented on the ineffability of religion and spirituality, meaning it's very difficult to put into words. We're trying to capture something that in some ways goes beyond our capacity to capture it in our language. We're talking about the infinite, the all-powerful. We're talking about experiences that seem to just point to our own human finitude and frailty. So how do we put it into words? In the old days, it's in my book, you can see it if you do want to enter stage 1 sleep, you might find this interesting. This is the figure where I describe spirituality it took me several years to develop this, and when I initially presented it, it was met with yawning, sleeping, saliva as people are trying to. So I've kind of put that aside, even though if you want to have an academic talk, I can be glad to talk to you about it. I still think it's pretty cool. But I've made my own transformation from this to talking about spirituality rather than through models and diagrams, but through more metaphor. That just as Moses and Aaron were taught not to look directly at God when they experienced God in the Hebrew Bible, I think we can't capture or look at this spirituality head on. And metaphor is a better way to do it. It's like instead of looking at it head on, you look at it through the corner of your eye. You just kind of get a glimpse of it that way. And the metaphor kind of captures that. So spirituality is kind of, and see if these metaphors aren't appealing to you. And I'm not suggesting these are the only metaphors, but I found them very helpful. So let's start off with a few ways of describing spirituality through metaphor. Now we're talking about what spirituality is. What do you see? How many people see a chalice? Okay, what else do you see? Faces. And faces, 2 figures, okay. What do you see? How many people see a face of a woman? Okay, y'all see that? How many people see, I don't know, it looks like a guy playing a saxophone. I see Bill Clinton. He looks like Bill Clinton to me. What do you see? Okay, how many people see an older woman? Okay, if your neighbor can't see it, point it out to them. Okay, I don't know if this is, this isn't going far, but the older woman, her, you can see a kind of big chin sticking out, and a big nose in profile. And then there's a younger woman. You see the younger woman? Her face is turning away. Do you see that? Okay. They're getting more complicated. What do you see? Do you see the tree? Do you see the face? It looks kind of like to me like either William Shakespeare or George Washington kind of face. You see the big forehead? Got it? Again, help your neighbor if your neighbor can't see it. And how many people see the woman walking on the path in a coat? You see it? Now you see it? Yeah, it's kind of like an aha. Now, if I were to say to you, okay, those of you who see the woman, you've got it right. And those of you who see the guy with the large forehead, that's not right. That would be crazy. To ask you which is correct would be miss the important point. It's not which is correct. They're both in the picture. In each of these, there's a figure and there's a ground. And to say which is the correct reading of the picture would be a silly question, because aren't they both correct? The picture has a figure and a ground. Okay, I'll give you the most challenging one. This has a lot going on in it. Okay, I'm sure you can see the chalice in the middle, right? That one's easy. What else do you see? Do you see the profiles of the man and the woman? That's kind of easy. Okay, that's not all. What else do you see? Do you see the woman holding her sombrero? Yeah, the left. Her nose is actually, the face of the older woman, her nose is the left arm and elbow of the woman in the sombrero, right? And now look at the guy's face. Yeah, his mustache is the bottom of a guitar, right? And his right arm is the arm playing the guitar. Okay, for those of you who are really good at this, what else do you see? Look in the left ear of the guy. It looks like there's a woman coming out of his left ear. It's the old standard woman coming out of the left ear picture. And I suspect there's probably more in that. Again, which of these views is accurate? They're all accurate. The point is, there's a figure and a ground, sometimes more than one ground to the figure. And so to really, truly see the picture, you have to see both the figure and the ground. You have to hold the figure and the ground together. You have to be open to the deeper dimension. That in any picture, there's a deeper dimension to the picture. That what you see on the surface is just part of the picture. I love that metaphor. It's probably my favorite metaphor for spirituality. Because spirituality says, faith says, there's something deeper going on. Don't take things at face value. That what you see isn't the full story. There is a figure and a ground, and we can learn to look for the deeper dimension in any kind of experience. That's an important, I think, defining attribute of spirituality. It's not only the ability to see the trees, but the larger forest. And so one way to think about spirituality, one metaphor is it's a way of seeing. It's a way of seeing, in particular, what I like to use the term, the sacred dimension of life. And by sacred, I'm referring not only to our understandings of God or divinity or Jesus, but also other aspects of life that can take on divine-like qualities. So marriage can become sacred. Children can become sacred. Nature can become sacred. Time can become sacred. The sacred refers then not only to the core, this godly core, but to other aspects of life. Work can be sacred. I would suggest that you treat your work as not a job. I know you make tons of money doing what you're doing, but that's not the only reason. You do what you do because it's a vocation. And what does a vocation mean? It means it's imbued with these sacred qualities. There's a divine-like quality to your work. That's what we mean by sacred. And I would suggest that people can hold many aspects of life as sacred. People can be seen as sacred. This was given to me by one of my grad students who kept a diary as an adolescent. And she wrote this when she was about 14. She's a gifted writer. And she says, God has a deep, raspy voice. God is a jazz singer. She's plush woman Rosie. God is a grandmother. He has the patient rock of an old man in a porch rocker. He hums and laughs. He marvels at the sky. God coos at babies. She's a new mother. I love that. God coos at babies. So when she sees people, who does she see? Like the figure ground, she sees people, but she sees a deeper dimension. She sees the sacred spark within people. Here's another quote that I really like, because here's someone who experiences something sacred in nature. The reason I like this quote in particular is it was shared by an atheist in Sweden. And one of my colleagues, Fereshte Ahmadi, did this interview. This is a woman who was dealing with cancer, and she was talking about what she gets by just being outside. And if you listen to her words, nature has these divine-like qualities. And she says, whatever happens in the world to me or others, nature is still there. It keeps going. That notion of timelessness, infinite. It's a feeling of security when everything else is chaos. The leaves fall off, new ones appear. Somewhere there's a pulse that keeps going. The silence becomes so apparent when you want to get away from all the noise. It's a spiritual feeling, if you can use that word without connecting to God. Okay, she doesn't believe in God, but she still experiences something sacred in nature, which is very common in Sweden. Sweden has a high proportion of atheists. But Sweden is also one of the most nature-oriented countries in the world. Where you go to Sweden, anytime you see tons of people just walking in the woods, skiing out there, and people together. It's kind of like the church. It's their church, and they connect around nature. I'm going to move on and just note, I'd like to have to, this is from Frederick Beckner, who is a theologian who sees, some people are so spiritually attuned, they can see the sacred in virtually any part of life. I think most of us were more limited that way. But he says, listen to your life, see it for the fathomless mystery it is, in the boredom and in the pain of it, no less than in excitement and gladness. Touch and taste your way to the holy. I love that. And hidden heart of it, because in the last analysis, all moments are key moments. Life itself is grace. Isn't that beautiful? Another metaphor. Spirituality is a magnet. It draws us forward. Whatever we hold sacred tends to become that force that attracts us most in our lives. I saw a woman in therapy, I'll call her Sue. She was 40 years old, and she had a glioblastoma, cancerous brain tumor. She was given 2 years to live. She had 2 children, and her oldest son was 10 years old. When I saw Sue, I asked how I could help her. And she said, well, she'd been told that she's only got 2 years to live, and her goal was to live long enough to see her son bar mitzvahed. They're Jewish. And she wanted my help, to encouragement and support, to live her life fully and to help her deal with the pain of the treatments that she was about to go through. And that's what we agreed to do. I helped her to sustain herself over the next few years. It was very clear that she held her children sacred. She would do anything for those kids. She would suffer anything for her children. And the dream of getting her child to young adulthood in the Jewish tradition through the bar mitzvah was her driving force in life. And I was with Sue as she went through a lot of this, and boy, she suffered a lot, but she was completely committed, and nothing was going to stop her. Sue, in fact, lived till a couple of months before her son graduated high school, almost till 18. So she was like one of these remarkable early success stories in treating glioblastoma. Made it almost 8 years after diagnosis. What was behind that, her survival? I think she had a magnet. Her sacred dream, destination, helped motivate her and keep her alive. By the way, we'll talk a little bit about this, but then the clinical implication is with clients who may be depressed, suffering from purposelessness, asking them, trying to help them locate what they hold sacred may be one of the most clinically useful things you can do. And I've defined sacred broadly, so you can do this kind of work with anyone, including atheists. Spirituality is an organizing force. Whatever we tend to hold sacred tends to become our organizing higher order value and goal in life. And we tend to then organize the rest of our life beneath that umbrella. Again, let's go back to you being here right now. You have invested incredible energy. You've organized much of your life to be able to pursue your vocation. I mean, think about how your life is defined in part by your vocation, your identity, where you spend your time and your resources. I mean, you're here right now, having committed a lot of resources to get here because this is something that's become an organizing force for you. Here's a dramatic illustration of this. And this is the story of, I'll call her Rachel. Now, I saw Rachel several years ago because she had been traumatized through a series of rapes years earlier. And I learned, it took me a while to learn, that she had developed a dissociative identity disorder, multiple personality, through these rapes. And it was very challenging working with Rachel because we would make some progress, and the goal was to help her become more whole. That's what our goal had been. But we'd make some progress, then one of her other personas would resist and would backtrack. Well, one day, after we'd been making some good progress, one of Rachel's, I believe at that time, 6 personas came out and said, this was her angry persona. She said, I want you to know we're terminating therapy. We're not coming back anymore. I'm only coming in now to be civil with you. This is our last session. Oh no, this can't be our last session. We need you, we need Ken, we can't stop seeing him, he's the only one who's keeping us going. We're not coming back anymore. No, we're not coming back. No. It's like family therapy. Having worked with her for a while, I mean, this didn't seem as strange as it probably sounds to you, but anyway, I asked the angry persona, what's your concern? She says, you've been working with us to become more trusting and less vigilant. You're placing us at greater risk. If we don't trust, if we don't constantly look around for the next rapist, we're more likely to be raped again. And that's what you're doing to us. And I'm here to protect us. I say, well, that's certainly not my goal. And, I'd be glad to talk with you more about it. Or if you feel like I'm not the right person to work with you, I'd be glad to refer you to another therapist, maybe a woman or somebody you'd be more comfortable with. But I do think you need to be in therapy. You need to have help. She had a suicidal persona that was also very dangerous. I said, I really think you need to be in therapy, but no, you can't talk like that. You have to set up another appointment. You have to make sure we come here. Well, to that persona, that childlike persona, I said, you've had more than your fair share of men telling you what to do or controlling your life, and I'm not going to be another one. I said, but I will tell you, I really think you need some help, and if I'm not the right person, then let's get you to somebody else who can help you. No, you can't do that. You're the only one who can help us. Well, I didn't know what was going to be. I said, well, I'll have your appointment for you next week, but you have to decide whether you want to be here. And I just said you, but the you was a kind of like a vague you. Who's going to decide? All I knew was that I couldn't decide for her. Even though she was fragmented, I couldn't make that decision for her. Well, she came back the next week, and I was so relieved. But then I met her seventh persona. And her seventh persona was calm and collected. And she sat down, and she said, I'd like to read you something from Scripture, which really surprised me because none of her personas had been particularly religious or spiritual. But this persona sat down quietly, and this is what she read. Something from Corinthians. She said, if the foot shall say, because I'm not the hand, I'm not of the body, it's therefore not of the body. If the whole body were an eye, where were the hearing? If the whole were hearing, where were the smelling? But now are they many members, yet but one body. And the eye cannot say unto the hand, I have no need of thee, nor again the head to the feet, that I have no need of you. Nay, much more those members of the body which seem to be more feeble are necessary. Wow, I read that, I heard that, and I thought to myself, you know, when Paul was preaching to the Corinthians, I didn't know there was such a huge number of people with dissociative identity disorder back then. because it seemed to be written for people who were fragmented. I mean, and I understand he was addressing a whole different layer and level, but it did strike me as a perfect kind of scriptural verse for someone with multiple personality. And it really quieted the angry persona. Now, who was this seventh persona? This was the spiritual persona. And her spiritual persona was my strongest ally for wholeness and integration. She became a key to helping my client Rachel find greater wholeness, not perfect wholeness, but greater wholeness. That's what spirituality does. The sacred becomes your overarching organizing value. And that's just a dramatic case of that point. Spirituality is also a stream. It's a journey. It's a process. It's a story. It's something in motion. One of the best ways to find out about spirituality is just to ask people, your clients, ask them, so tell me something about your spiritual journey. And people just get it because it's all coded in the form of a narrative, a story. It's a process. From birth to death, we have a spiritual journey we're on. And we're all still in the midst of it. It's a process. We'll talk more about that. That's another great metaphor. And I define spirituality as a journey, as a search for the sacred, consisting of these dimensions: discovery, conservation, struggle, transformation. I'm not going to go into this one in much detail because it's the weirdest one, but if you're interested, you can email me, and I can tell you how spirituality is an onion. I do want to talk a little bit about this. And spirituality is double-edged, double-sided. It has the potential for wonderful good and the potential for pain and suffering. And we need to appreciate both sides of it as counselors. My graduate students and I have done a lot of work trying to identify what are the ingredients within faith that facilitate health and well-being. And we've done lots of studies on what we call spiritual coping, religious and spiritual coping resources. And one is the ability in the faith traditions to frame pain and suffering in a more benevolent context. Religion doesn't deny the reality of pain. It just says pain needs to be understood in a larger context. Pain doesn't have the final word. It doesn't have the ultimate word. And here's an example of a Hindu woman who has a neuromuscular disorder, and she's talking about how her disability helps her grow in ways along the path to God consciousness. She says life is riddled with physical frustrations, but wealthy in opportunities for spiritual growth. She's not denying her pain. She just places it in a larger, more benevolent context. Powerful resource. We found that people who can frame their suffering in this larger context experience much greater well-being and less depression, less anxiety. Spiritual support. People can gain support from their faith, from their relationship with God, in ways they may not be able to get from other finite, frail human creatures. This is a picture that was drawn by a young girl, 12 years old, with cystic fibrosis. Sarah Pendleton, a pediatrician, had done this study of children hospitalized for cystic fibrosis, where she asked them to describe what helped keep them going in their pain and their suffering in the hospital. This girl, 12 years old, drew this picture, and Sarah, a friend of mine, this was published in a journal, Pediatrics. I asked Sarah about this, and Sarah told me the story. She went into this girl's room, and the girl gave her the picture, and Sarah said, "This is beautiful. Can you tell me about it?" And the little girl said, "Oh, this is an eye." So I said, "I see, it's a really great eye. Can you tell me any more?" And the little girl said, "Oh, well, this is an eye, and you can see it's a tearing eye. It's crying." She said, "I see, it's a sad eye." And Sarah said, "Yeah, that's God's eye. God's crying for me." Well, what this little girl is experiencing is this sense of support from God, a God who can cry for her, suffer along with her in her pain, right? Her parents can come and go. The nurses and doctors in the hospital can come and go. But God for her is available 24/7. Spiritual support is something that's offered more continuously and is constantly available. It's one of the things that makes it a very special type of resource. Just mention a few other resources that we've identified. One is support from organized religious traditions, from clergy, from churches. I like this quote. This is from a Puerto Rican woman who's HIV. And she says, she's talking about her pastor in church. She says, the pastor there, he doesn't look down on people with HIV. The congregation prays, they pray for all kinds of things without saying anyone in particular, but they also pray for people with HIV and who have AIDS. That's my support group, my church, a special source of support through religious community. Let me talk about one more kind of valuable resource in coping that we gained through spirituality that we've studied, and it's the capacity to foster dramatic change. I'm really interested in how faith communities and spiritual experience and expression can foster dramatic change. Why am I so interested in it? Well, I mean, like you, I encounter people who need dramatic change in their lives. Those of you who work with drug, alcohol, addictive disorders, you're seeing people, some of them some whose lives are really at risk. They need to make a change. They may be close to end-stage alcoholism. They better make a change or they're not going to survive. And it can't be what we usually do, which is small steps change. We need dramatic change. And I think religious communities and traditions have that kind of capacity to foster dramatic change. And some of that may be through conversion experience. Some of it may be, though, through what William Miller, who's one of the real leaders of alcoholism research and study, he talks about quantum change, experiences of dramatic change that lead to major transformation in life. And he has a book called Quantum Change. I recommend it. It's a very small book. But he describes these people who've had spiritual experiences largely that led to dramatic change in their lives that was sustained. I'm fascinated by that. How can people have a change in their lives, some encounter or experience that is life-altering, particularly relevant for people with addictive disorders? He kind of documents this. He's got great stories of dramatic change in this book. But he also then looked at reports of shifts in what people value, what people hold sacred before and after their change, their quantum change. This is in men. Before they had their quantum change, this is what they said they valued. Wealth, adventure, achievement, pleasure, and respect. These are guy values. These are like manly values, right? Now look at how the values change, they say, after their quantum change. Spirituality, personal peace, family, God's will, honesty. It's almost like two different people. Imagine being with someone who values that first set of values versus someone who values the second set. They'd be different people. Very dramatic. Well, he also did the same thing for women who experienced quantum change. So for women, before their quantum change, they valued family, independence, career, fitting in, and attractiveness. Okay, so womanly values. What did they look like after their quantum change? Growth, self-esteem, spirituality, happiness, and generosity. I think fascinating set of values. I just presented this a couple of weeks ago at another meeting, and someone said, it's almost as if the guys following their quantum change are becoming more womanly, and the women following the quantum change are becoming more manly. They're focusing more on self-esteem and growth and more their own personal kinds of changes. And actually, there's some evidence that as we later stages of our life, there is that kind of coming together of our values and trajectories for men and women. You get, maybe of men later in life who tend to become more generous and caring and compassionate. And women later in life can begin to do more things for their own independence and focus more on themselves and their own interests as their families have grown up and moved on.
If you have good news, we expect you to want to share it. Salvation in Jesus Christ, the Son of God, who for love of us and for our salvation came down from heaven. Salvation in His name, and He is the only Savior, is what we are on earth for. Therefore, all those who spread the good news of salvation in Jesus Christ, we should encourage them. I can speak, but how many people can I reach alone? But the media, the television people, the radio, the newspapers, and all those who use the computer and its derivatives in various ways to spread the gospel, we must thank them, we must encourage them, we must work with them so that they can continue to spread the good news. There's so much news that is not so wonderful in the world, but there is also news that is wonderful on the gospel of Jesus Christ. We encourage them and beg God to bless them, especially the Shalom World TV. God bless you.
Shalom World, God's own channel.